Alright, so meanwhile, back at the farm, a few years have passed and you are strolling through the orchard admiring the bountiful harvest that's been produced through what you have come to know as a selective breeding process. You have made a good decision, protecting your crops, and have supported your family and employees financially through the sale of the excess crops each season. It has been a good few years and everyone on the farm is happy and healthy, including the animals that live on the farm. As you're working around the orchard, some of the farm dogs run up to greet you. You notice that the dogs are very different in many ways. This leads you to realize that apple farmers aren't the only ones who have used selective breeding throughout history. Have you ever seen examples of the effects of selective breeding? So pause and think. Can you think of animals or organisms that have been selected for having better traits throughout history? So in your daily life, let's think. For example, maybe in agriculture. We'll talk here soon about some other types like cows being bred for more milk, or different strains of wheat being more cold tolerant. But let's focus in on dogs, a dog's life, the cuddler, the farm alarm, and the critter getter. The farm's resident pug Logan trots up to you with a snort and a wagging stubby curly tail. Logan keeps the children on the farm company and is a very affectionate lapdog. You can usually find Logan inside the farmhouse getting all the cuddles and pets. Casually strolling close behind and measuring several feet taller than Logan is Zeta, the Great Dane who protects the humans of the farm while they sleep. Zeta is strong and has a deep bark that alerts the humans when there is trouble nearby. Finally, Brinley the Dachshund joins the group. Her legs are short, so it takes her a little longer to arrive at her destination, but she is a valuable part of the team as she hunts varmints that might threaten the orchard. So pugs, dachshunds, and Great Danes might not look related, but genetic studies have shown that wolves and dogs have common ancestors as recently as 15,000 to 40,000 years ago. Since then, humans have been using domestication and selective breeding to create dogs with different features, skill sets, and even intelligences. And that gets back to our conversation. Remember, we did look at some studies that showed that intelligence was heritable or could be passed on. Specifically looking at twin studies and having twins that had very similar intelligences. If you wanted to breed... Alright, so now we get to sort the characteristics associated with each breed. So if we read correctly, we can see here, short snout. Alright, the Great Dane is muscular. The Dachshund has short legs, the Great Dane has long legs. The pug has a curly tail, and a long body is the Dachshund. Woof! Okay, so, how have humans used selective breeding to adapt dogs to specific roles? What other roles do you think dogs might be well suited to with more selective breeding? So you might say something like, dogs are bred or selectively bred, right, to perform different roles. And then maybe you want to list some of those roles, such as hunting, companion. Maybe even you could think about dogs that are used for search and rescue. There's dogs that are used as guide dogs. Maybe mushing for the Iditarod, right? Dog sled racing. All things like that. Okay, so go ahead and type that out. Press next. So, for example, cats, palm trees, chickens, cows, sheep, the list goes on and on. Can you think of how and why these might have been selectively bred? Palm trees sometimes are bred to be shorter and stumpier so you can reach the fruit. Chickens to lay more eggs, cows to produce more milk, sheep more wool, cats to be cute and fluffy and furry, nice and docile. Crops and selective breeding, historically helpful. So, how has selective breeding been used by farmers to grow their crops? Whether selectively breeding dogs to hunt or crops to feed their families, humans have followed the same procedure for millennia. Over generations of encouraging breeding of desirable traits and discouraging breeding of undesirable traits, we have shaped the organisms around us. Some of the goals of selective breeding have included crop plants with better yields, ornamental plants with particular flower shapes and colors, farm animals that produce more and better quality meat, milk, or wool, pets with particular physiques and temperaments. This includes animals that are suited to do jobs like herd sheep and also characteristics beneficial to humans, such as having a low dander, which makes them less likely to cause allergic reactions for their owners. So even if you want a pet, sometimes you can't because you have allergies, that is a good option. I also know there's animals that are bred with shorter fur, that can oftentimes help too. Use your deduction skills to arrange the images below in a logical order. Okay, so how could this happen? We're going to repeat this process for several generations down the line, but first, we're going to let's see here. There's a natural variation, and then we're going to choose from that which individuals have the most desirable trait. We're going to repeat this process for many generations, and then over the time, the crop will increase. What are the dangers of selective breeding? Selective breeding has benefited humans for centuries, but as with technology, there are drawbacks. Here are some problems with selective breeding. They can result in a population of animals or plants with very similar genetics. Similar genetics means that the population will have the same strengths, but also the same weaknesses. Infectious diseases are more likely to spread through genetically similar populations because they are vulnerable to the same diseases. Selective breeding often involves breeding individuals that are closely related, known as inbreeding. Inbred populations are more likely to suffer from genetic conditions inherited from their parents. Although selective breeding has helped shape a lot of the plants and animals around us, it isn't the only way that species have transformed. Organisms have changed throughout history, sometimes through selective breeding, sometimes not. And you know what that's called? If it's just natural through the environment, it's not artificial selection, but natural selection. Unlike selective breeding, which is driven by human intervention, natural selection is driven by environmental factors that limit survival and reproduction. Do you recall the earlier lesson entitled The Birds and the Moth? In that lesson, you explored natural selection. Let's review. So yeah, and I just wanted to say a note here to summarize this. Oftentimes that is the issue with when we talk about having a monoculture with crops. You have the whole cornfield, and if a parasite or if some disease were to come through, it would wipe out the whole field, and that's one of the concerns. All right, a very mothy mystery. Okay, if we think back to this lesson, do you remember why the white and black speckled moths were disappearing in Britain? Minimum 50 characteristics, so the birds, right, were eating white and speckled moths because they stood out against the soot-covered trees from industrial pollution. Okay, and here they summarize here, scientists came to discover that the reason behind the change in the moths in some British cities was that birds had been able to easily spot the white moths against the dark smoggy sky and soot-blackened tree trunks, and the darker moths could hide from the birds because of their color. Because of this, light-colored moths started to dwindle near the city centers as their dark family members' numbers increased. Pollution didn't make the black moths, but it did give the advantage to any moth that was carrying the genetic change that changed their wings black. This is an example of natural selection. The moth's environment was altered so only moths with certain characteristics survived long enough to reproduce. Natural selection and selective breeding. What's the difference? Maybe we make a Venn diagram here in our notes. I'll go ahead and show you that. Natural selection is driven by environmental factors that limit survival and reproduction, such as harsh environments or competition for mates. Selective breeding is driven by human intervention in order to strengthen a desired trait in an organism. Now that we have learned a little bit about selective breeding and natural selection, can you determine which category the scenarios below belong to? Let's find out. Which of the following are examples of selective breeding? Some farmers produce square watermelons by growing watermelons in square-shaped molds or containers. So that's not selective breeding because there's nothing to do with the reproduction of it. They're just grown in a square. I think that's really cool though. Okay, a potato crop. Potato crop is partially destroyed by a new strain of potato-hungry muncher bugs. So the remaining crops are the only parent crop the farmer has to use to plant for the next season. That, I think, be an example of natural selection, but not necessarily selective breeding. We need to choose to domesticate them and breed them for a specific reason, like pigs for more meat. Rubber-producing plants, Guayule, Parthenium argentatum, was bred with its northern relatives to produce hybrid plants that could transfer cold tolerance to Guayule. That's true. So yeah, rubber comes from plants. You guys know that? That's pretty cool. Sheep farmers want their sheep to produce more wool, so they only breed sheep with the thickest wool. Again, selective breeding. There's a flood. Half of the crops on the farm are destroyed. The farmers can use only the seeds from the remaining crops to plant the plants for next season. That would be not necessarily us looking out for that, but more so a cause of the natural environment. Beekeepers want their honey to taste more floral, so they will allow their bees to collect pollen from lavender fields. Not necessarily selective breeding, just a way of changing the environment of your bees for a desirable outcome, but not through reproduction. Okay, matching game. Can you find food in the wild? Below are images of fruits and vegetables that have changed throughout the years due to selective breeding. Match the wild plant to the domesticated version. Oh yeah, this is pretty fun. Okay, so here we can see these strawberries look different. What do we got here? This is what corn used to look like. Believe it or not. Bananas. Here we have a more tightly bound cauliflower. And the last thing there is the eggplant. A fungus among us, back to the future. Let's head back to the farm. A century has passed, and the land is now owned by the great-great-grandchildren of the farmers we met earlier. You will assume the role of one of these relatives and make some decisions about how to run the farm moving forward. Your family has had healthy and abundant crops due to your great-great-grandparents' decision to use selective breeding techniques. You have never had to struggle to make ends meet. Your farm is fruitful, and you and your family are healthy and happy. But today you got some scary news. You were told that your neighbor's crops were devastated by a fungus, and, sadly, they will not have any crops to harvest this year. There is something called genetically modified organisms that you and your family have heard about in the farming community, but you need to collect some facts in order to make an informed decision to ensure your family's well-being. Luckily, no matter what your family decides, farmers in the United States are supported by federal farming subsidies or government help, so even if you lose your crop, you could have a financial safety net so your farm might have a chance to recover. Even if the farm did not recover, there is very little chance of you or your family starving to death as a result, because there are plenty of farms in the area to provide food and programs to help feed the hungry. But the farm is important to your family and your livelihood, so let's see what options there are to help prevent that from being necessary. So here, one person asks, what are GMOs? And the other farmer asks, that's a great question. Let's figure it out. Okay. So we'll just figure out what GMOs are before we make a decision. It's a new technology. As we have seen, people have been altering plants and animals for many years using traditional breeding techniques such as selective breeding. Selective breeding has resulted in countless variations of organisms, ranging from giant pumpkins to hairless cats. But this type of selection, in which organisms that exhibit specific traits are chosen to breed offspring with specific characteristics has been limited to naturally occurring variations until recent decades. However, advances in the field of genetic technologies have allowed for control over the genetic changes introduced into an organism. Now, scientists can incorporate new genes from one species to a completely unrelated species through genetic engineering. This produces results that could have never occurred without scientific advancements. For instance, scientists can take genes from a fish that survives in very cold temperatures and insert those genes into crops to prevent the crops from freezing during frosty weather. Now it's time to brainstorm. If you could take genes from any organism on Earth and insert them into another organism in order to create a GMO with specific traits, what organism would you choose and why? So I'll give you some examples and maybe you can come up with your own from there. So you could get wild here and take any gene and a trait from another organism, like an elephant gene for making something really big, and put it in something really small and make a giant thing, right? So just go creative here. Some more realistic examples are making things produce vaccines or making them glow. There's what's called a green fluorescent protein that we could put in, if you've ever seen glowing goldfish, glowfish. You could make a glowing animal. Or glowing nail polish. I think that would be kind of cool. So you put the nail polish on, and it would change your finger DNA, your skin around it. All right. So genetic modification process, it's your turn. Match the GMO process to the image. It relates to below copying the gene. Okay, that's going to look like this. All right, here we have DNA extraction, pulling out the DNA. We're going to copy the gene. Here we have our polymerase that makes more copies of DNA. We can put a new gene into the plant, and we use a gene gun for that, which is kind of fun. But they can just blast a new gene right in there. Breeding the plant like that, modifying the gene, so maybe changing part of it. So, and here it says the process for directly inserting genes is complex, but we know how it works and produces great outcomes. All right, so now we have to make a decision, weighing the options. Genetically modified organisms have allowed farmers to increase crop yields, reduce costs of food production, and create crops resistant to pests and diseases, ensuring greater food security to the world's growing population. A number of animals have also been genetically engineered to increase their meat, milk, or wool production and decrease susceptibility or the ability to get a disease. When comparing selective breeding and GMOs, it's important to realize that there are pros and cons to each technology. Potential pros for GMOs: guaranteed to survive the fungus and readily available. And cons are unsure of long-term effects to people and long-term effects to the environment. The potential pros for selective breeding: long-term effects are well understood because we've been doing this for centuries and well-established precedent. Potential cons for selective breeding: not guaranteed to work and could lose entire crops and can take multiple generations to show signs of actually working. So now it's time to make our decision. You're in charge of your family's apple orchard and have a decision to make in the face of the fungal threat. Do you selectively breed your existing apple trees, or do you purchase genetically modified seeds that are engineered to be resistant to the fungus? Remember, you can continue to use selective breeding using potential crop candidates that might be immune to the fungus, but you will not know with 100% certainty whether or not the outcome will produce fruit trees that are immune to the fungus for next season. Or you can purchase GMO strains of apples and use them as your crops. It's important to note that these are usually sterile. They most likely will not produce seeds that will grow if planted, and you will need to buy them every planting season. If you choose this option, it will cut into your earnings for selling the crop. So quite a few things to consider here. So I'll go ahead and let you make your decision. Okay, so let's say you selected GMOs. Here's the page that comes up for that. It says, now you're at the cutting edge of agricultural technology. Congratulations on your purchase of Giant Harvest Advanced Seed apple seedlings In addition to being resistant to fungal infection, these trees have been genetically modified to produce up to 35% more fruit and up to 20% larger fruit on average than the wild-type apple trees. So we hope you've been buying some extra warehouse space. These particular apples were modified by inserting a bacterial gene that produces a chemical that is toxic to apple tree fungus. A second gene from the different plant species was added to promote rapid growth of new buds, leading to more and larger apples. Neither gene has been tested in humans, but the bacteria and plant that the original genes were harvested from are not known to be toxic. To prevent creating hybrids with wild apple trees and to protect intellectual property, or the information, basically, to do that, the apple trees grown from these seeds will not be able to produce their own offspring. You may want to keep some extra seeds at hand, just in case. You could also order some more each year to replace trees that have failed. So now you can reflect on how your choice to use genetically modified seeds benefits your interests as a farmer, what risks or detriments, consequences, should you be aware of. Make sure to discuss both the benefits and the drawbacks of your choice. Okay, so go ahead and reflect on that. Okay, and let's say you selected selective breeding. This is the page that comes up. Do-it-yourself agriculture, it's tried and true. Sometimes old methods are best. You reason. Gather only the seeds from your healthiest and most fruitful trees. You replace diseased and dying trees in the orchards in hopes of a bountiful harvest. It will take several years for the trees to mature as they endure storms, heat, cold, and the threat of fungal infections. Only then will you know if your decision bears fruit. Until then, you'll have to rely on the remaining trees in your orchard. However, you can take solace in the fact that you know that apples produced by the new trees will be delicious and healthy, just like the fruits produced by their parents. You could even repeat your selective breeding process again to get even more, better, more fungus-resistant trees if it works. Now, all that's left to do is water, fertilize, and wait. So then go ahead and reflect on the drawbacks here. And I'm excited to see what you guys had to say in the live lesson. All right, let's go ahead and reflect. How satisfied are you with the result of your decision? And maybe through watching this video lesson, you were able to kind of choose both there. So go ahead and reflect on the benefits and drawbacks of each choice. And then sort the images below on the category you suspect that they belong to. Okay, so here's the organism. Are they genetically modified, selectively bred, or neither? Puppies, usually selectively bred. Glowing mice, you'd have to insert a glowing gene. Trees grown in a different way, maybe are neither. And this is interesting. I wonder where they want you to put this. You can make this effect potentially with water, just going up the phloem and the xylem, up the plants, but I bet they're saying it's maybe genetically modified. Let's see. Yeah, okay. I was right on that, so that's neither. Okay, cool. Well, we'll pause there. I'll upload this for part C. Your next bit here is to choose your own adventure, so I'm going to let you go ahead and do that yourself. And then come to class ready to summarize what you have discovered here with in these decisions. All right. Good luck. Have fun. Your conclusion here is the last thing. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to demonstrate a general knowledge of the differences between selective breeding and genetically modified, explore political and economic ramifications around the world, that's what you just did, and then make decisions regarding selective breeding and GMOs in a farm setting through your short essay. All right, good luck, and we'll see you on Friday.